Inside the cell blocks of Britain's most dangerous inmates, a deafening alarm explodes through the prison. A steel door slams shut, and a single inmate stands frozen, his hands shaking as a hidden camera lens clicks on above his head. For a moment, nobody moves. Nobody breathes. The red light on the camera blinks once. Then a voice from the intercom whispers, "Inmate on C block, step away from the door." But the inmate doesn't move, because something is happening inside that cell the officers cannot see. What did the camera catch? What is happening behind that steel door? The prison built to break you. Britain's most dangerous inmates are held in blocks where every sound echoes like it's alive. The walls are thick, cold, and built for one thing: control. This place isn't designed for comfort. It's designed for survival. Inside these cell blocks, officers move in pairs, sometimes in threes. Not because of fear, but because experience has taught them that one wrong step can change everything. Every inmate here is classified as Category A, the highest security level in the UK. Some have attempted escapes. Some are connected to violent organized networks outside. Others are simply unpredictable. But inside these blocks, labels don't matter. What matters is routine, because routine keeps everyone alive. Every morning, the cell doors open in a rhythm. Clang, clang, clang. It's a sound that shakes the floor. Inmates step out slowly, hands visible, eyes scanning. Officers watch every movement, every breath. The corridors are narrow, long tunnels of steel and silence, and every corner feels like a question. Will something happen today? On the walls, tiny black domes hide cameras that never sleep. They track movement, map behavior, and alert officers when someone does something unusual, like the inmate in the hook. But today, as we move deeper inside the blocks, something becomes clear. This is not a normal prison. This is a machine, a place built to contain people the country cannot risk losing control of. Inmates feel it. Officers feel it. Even the air feels heavy, like it's carrying stories that no one wants to speak out loud. And as we move deeper into C block, the block in our opening hook, the tension rises. Because this is the block with the strictest rules, the toughest inmates, and the highest number of security alerts in the entire facility. This is where Britain's most dangerous inmates sleep, eat, fight, think, and survive. One day at a time. And the incident in the hook? It didn't start with an alarm. It started with a decision, one inmate's decision, hours before the cameras caught it. And now, we go back to see exactly how it began. The inmate who changed the routine. Hours before the alarm in the hook, C block looked almost calm, almost normal. Officers were doing their early checks. Inmates were waking up to the same echoing sounds: metal doors, heavy boots, and distant voices. But one inmate, the same one we saw in the hook, was already awake. His name in this story will be Mason, a man known across multiple UK prisons for one thing. He never reacts unless he wants to. Some inmates explode with anger. Some shout. Some pace their cells nonstop. But Mason? He was the kind who could sit silently for hours, staring at the floor, thinking, planning, waiting. And that morning he did something different. Something tiny. Something small enough that a new officer might miss it, but not the cameras. He folded his bedsheet twice. Not in a messy, half-sleeping way. Perfectly. Neatly. As if he was preparing for something. Then he sat on the edge of his bed, perfectly still, shoulders tight, jaw locked. By 7:45 a.m., the officers began unlocking doors for the morning routine. C block operates in phases. First row, then second row, then the exercise corridor. Mason's cell was near the middle, right where sound travels the loudest. When his door opened, he didn't step out immediately. He waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The officer glanced inside, saw that Mason was sitting quietly, and gave a nod. Nothing unusual, or so they thought. But the camera above his cell? It registered something subtle, a shift in his posture, a delayed reaction, a tiny deviation from his usual routine. And in this place, any change is a warning. Inside the block, the atmosphere tightens. As inmates began to move into the corridor, You could feel the tension thickening. These cell blocks aren't like normal prisons. Every inmate here has a history of danger, organized crime, extreme violence, escape attempts, or unpredictable behavior that makes every second unpredictable. Officers walk sideways sometimes, so they can see both directions. They keep their radios close to their lips. Their eyes scan the floor, the hands, the corners, the speed of a walk, the tone of a voice. And behind all that noise, all that movement, Mason slipped into the corridor. Slowly, quietly, still not speaking to anyone. His eyes were sharp, not wild, not angry, but focused in a way that officers instantly pick up on. Something was wrong. Nobody knew what yet, but the block felt it. Even the other inmates looked at him differently. One stepped aside. Another avoided eye contact. These men can read danger like weather. Something was coming. The movement that started it all. Down the hall, an officer noticed Mason staring at one of the black camera domes. Just staring. Not aggressively, but as if he was waiting for it to move. The officer whispered into his radio. "Control, can we get eyes on C block? Inmate 204 is acting off." Control replied. "Copy. We're watching." The cameras zoomed, tracked, mapped his behavior, and then he suddenly stepped backward toward his own cell door. Not normal. Not during movement. Not during open routine. It was small. It was subtle. But it was enough. The officer's hand moved toward the alarm button on his belt. And somewhere inside Mason's cell, something shifted. Something the officers still didn't understand yet. Something that would trigger the full alert alarm we heard in the hook. All of this was building toward that 3-second explosion of chaos. What the camera caught, and what Mason planned, is about to be revealed. The moment the cameras caught everything, the air inside C block felt heavier than usual. Officers could sense it. Inmates could feel it. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. Mason stood halfway between the open corridor and his cell, 1 foot in light, 1 foot in shadow. A place where nobody usually stops. He looked back at his bed, perfectly folded. At the wall where he had scratched tiny marks over the months. At the camera dome above his head, which blinked its faint red light. It was then, in that exact moment, the camera zoomed. Something about his posture triggered the system's alert. Deviation from routine. A simple line of text flashed inside the control room, but in this prison, that's enough to turn normal into dangerous. One officer started walking toward Mason. Not running. Not panicking. Just controlled steps, trained steps. "Mason, what's going on?" the officer asked calmly. But Mason didn't blink. Didn't answer. Didn't move. Then he did something that changed everything. He turned slightly, just enough for the camera to see inside his cell. And that's when the system detected it. A shape. A movement. Something hidden behind the bottom corner of Mason's metal bed frame. Not a person. Not a weapon. Something else. Something the cameras weren't supposed to detect inside a high-security cell. A small, improvised object. Metal. Modified. A tool. The kind inmates are never allowed to have. The kind the system labels as unauthorized metal device, high risk. The alert jumped from yellow to red. The control room supervisor's voice erupted through the intercom. "C block, freeze positions. Repeat, freeze positions." Officers stopped instantly. Inmates froze mid-step. Even conversations cut off like a switch had been flipped. Only Mason kept moving. He stepped backward. Back into the cell. Back toward the hidden tool on the floor. Not running. Not lunging. Just calm, slow steps toward the thing that triggered the entire lockdown. And that's when the alarm in the hook exploded. Whoop, whoop, whoop. A full emergency alert. But inside the cell, something else happened. The camera saw Mason reach down, not to grab the tool, but to cover it with his hand. He wasn't attacking. He wasn't breaking anything. He was protecting something. Which made the officers realize they weren't dealing with a violent outburst. They were dealing with a secret. Something Mason hid. Something he didn't want anyone to see. Something important enough to risk a full lockdown. And that raised the question. What would a Category A inmate protect more than his own freedom? More than his privileges? More than avoiding lockdown? Whatever it was, the officers were about to find out. And the answer would shake the entire block. The secret inside the cell. The alarm kept echoing through C block, bouncing off the steel like thunder trapped in a tunnel. Officers formed a tight line, moving with shields raised and radios clicking as control monitored every second. But Mason, he didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He didn't even look scared. He knelt on the floor of his cell, one hand covering the small metal object the cameras detected. Not gripping it, not lifting it, just protecting it. That confused everyone. Most high-risk inmates hide things for power, for fear, for control, for survival. But Mason's movements weren't aggressive. They were careful, almost gentle, as if the thing under his hand meant more to him than the consequences heading his way. And consequences were coming fast. The officers arrive. 2 officers reached his cell first. Their shields locked together. Their boots planted wide. Their voices firm and trained. Mason, hands where we can see them. He stayed still. Mace, you take your hand off the floor. Still nothing. One officer tapped the radio on his vest. Control, inmate is non-responsive. Preparing to contain. Control responded immediately. Copy. Proceed with caution. Object unknown. In the corridor behind the officers, the rest of C block watched in silence. Even the toughest inmates lowered their eyes. Because when the block goes into a situation like this, everyone understands 2 things. 1. The response will be swift. 2. Whatever the inmate is hiding must be serious. The reveal begins. Finally, slowly, Mason lifted his hand. The officers braced. And there it was. A tiny metal frame. Bent wire. Thin scraps twisted together. But it wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a tool for escape. It was a tiny homemade picture frame. Inside it, held up by tape and folded cereal box cardboard, was a small, creased, worn photo. A child, maybe 6 or 7, smiling, missing a front tooth. A child Mason hadn't seen in years. The metal tool wasn't a tool at all. It was the frame he built to keep the picture protected. And earlier, when he folded his bedsheet, he had accidentally knocked the frame loose. When it fell under the bed, the metal edges triggered the motion and shape detection algorithm. The system saw metal object. The system assumed danger. And Mason was simply trying to protect the only thing he had left that reminded him he was still human. The block fell silent. Officers lowered their shields an inch. Not because the situation was safe, but because they finally understood what they were seeing. Even the camera stopped zooming. This wasn't an attack. This wasn't a threat. This was something else. A father holding on to a memory the system didn't understand. But the situation wasn't over. Procedures still mattered. Rules still mattered. Anything homemade, even harmless, must be inspected. And as officers prepared to step inside to retrieve the object, the tension shifted again. Because Mason didn't let go of the frame. He held it gently in his hands and whispered something nobody expected. Please, don't take this. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was fear, the kind that doesn't make noise but weighs a person down. And now the officers faced a decision. Follow protocol immediately, or slow things down before the block spiraled into chaos again. Because the inmates watching from the corridor, they saw everything. And in a place like this, even a harmless moment can become dangerous if not handled carefully. The next step the officers took would decide whether the block stayed calm or exploded. The decision that could break the block. Inside C block, every second felt stretched, tight, and unforgiving. 2 officers stood at Mason's cell door, shields raised but lowered enough to show they understood the situation. The corridor behind them was silent, a rare silence. Every inmate was watching. Not out of kindness. Not out of curiosity. But because whatever happened next would tell them one thing. How far the system would go, even over something small. And small things matter in prison. A photo. A memory. A link to the outside world. They're not just objects here, they're lifelines. Mason holds the frame tighter. He didn't shout. He didn't resist. He just held the tiny metal frame in both hands, his thumbs resting lightly on the taped edges. "Please, don't take this," he whispered again. His voice didn't sound like a Category A inmate. It didn't sound like a man feared in 3 different prisons. It sounded like a father who hadn't seen his child in years, holding on to the only thing he had left. The lead officer exhaled slowly. Protocol said they must remove the handmade frame. Rules said any metal object must be confiscated. Safety guidelines said no exceptions. But officers aren't robots. They see things the cameras can't understand. The officer knelt slightly, lowering the shield a bit more. A gesture that, inside these walls, means calm, not weakness. "Mason," he said, voice steady, "we just need to check it. That's all." Mason shook his head. "They'll take it. They always take things." His hands trembled, not in anger, but in fear. And fear in a high-security prison can spread like wildfire. The tension builds. Inmates along the corridor shifted their weight. Small movements. Hard to notice. But officers noticed. A man in cell 12 leaned forward. Another rested his hands on the rail. A third folded his arms tightly. If they believed officers were about to crush something personal, something harmless, the block could turn volatile. Because inmates don't unite over power. They unite over loss. Every officer knew it. And that is when the second officer made the call that nobody expected. He stepped forward, so hands visible, and said, "Let me see it while it stays in your hands." It wasn't protocol. It wasn't in the manuals. But it was smart. It allowed them to follow the rules. Without triggering a storm. Mason hesitated, his chest rising and falling quickly. Then, to the surprise of everyone, he lifted the tiny frame slightly, just enough for the officer to examine it without touching. Metal scraps. Bending marks. Tape. Serial cardboard. A worn, fading photograph. No hidden blades. No sharpened edges. Nothing dangerous. Just a father's memory. The officer nodded. "All right," he said softly. "You can keep it. But we're going to secure it properly so it doesn't trigger alarms again." Mason blinked, shocked more than relieved. "Secure it how?" "We'll help you protect it. Properly." Aloud. A moment of silence followed. And in that silence, the entire cell block relaxed, shoulders lowered, hands dropped, tension fading like fog evaporating under sunlight. It wasn't victory. It wasn't weakness. It was understanding. A rare thing inside a place built for steel, rules, and control. But the block was still on lockdown. The alarm had been triggered. The protocols were active. C-block wasn't done. Control still needed answers. And Mason's small picture frame wasn't the only thing they found inside that cell. Because while examining the area, an officer noticed something else. A small scratch on the floor. A scrape. A mark that wasn't there yesterday. A mark that suggested something, or someone, had moved differently inside that cell during the night. And that meant one thing. The story wasn't over. Something else was happening in Mason's cell. Something the picture frame didn't explain. Something the officers now had to uncover. The scratch mark that changed everything. C-block slowly eased out of its tension, but the lockdown wasn't lifted yet. Even though the officers understood the truth about Mason's homemade frame, something else had caught their attention. A long, thin scratch across the concrete floor, near the back corner of the cell. At first, it looked like nothing, just another mark in a place full of marks. But experienced officers know the difference between random damage and a new sign of movement. One officer pointed at it. "That wasn't here last week," he murmured. Another crouched down to inspect it. The angle of the scratch. The depth. The direction. It wasn't made by a tool. Wasn't made by a shoe. Wasn't part of normal wear. It looked like something heavy had been dragged, but carefully. Slowly. Quietly. Mason didn't react when they noticed it. He just sat on the edge of his bed, holding the small frame like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. But officers? They weren't satisfied. The homemade frame explained why the alarm triggered. But it didn't explain this. The officers start their inspection. "Control, we need authorization for a full in-cell check," the lead officer said into his radio. Control didn't hesitate. Approved. Proceed. 2 officers stepped inside the cell. Shields lowered now, but gloves on, always gloves on. Mason didn't fight it. Didn't move. Didn't speak. He just watched. The officers checked the corners first. Under the sink. Behind the metal desk. Around the toilet. Nothing unusual. Then one officer placed his hand on the metal bed frame. And pushed. It didn't budge. He tried again. Still nothing. Beds in these cells are bolted directly to the floor with reinforced brackets. They don't move unless something forces them to. Which made the scratch even stranger. Something doesn't add up. The officer turned to Mason. Did you move your bed? Mason didn't look up. No. Did anyone come into your cell last night? No. Did you hear anything? Anything unusual? Mason finally lifted his eyes. And that's when the officer realized something. Mason wasn't lying. Mason wasn't hiding something. Mason was confused. Dangerous inmates rarely show confusion. It's not a safe emotion in prison. But Mason's expression made it clear. He didn't know how the scratch got there. That changed everything. Because if Mason didn't move the bed, and no officer moved the bed, something else must have caused that mark. And in a high-security prison, there are only a few possibilities. 3 to be exact. An officer accidentally kicked something heavy under the bed during night checks. Unlikely, night checks are too controlled. Another inmate slid something under Mason's door that he didn't notice. Impossible, the gap under the door is too small. Something fell. Something heavy enough to drag, scrape, and leave a mark. But in a place where nothing belongs to inmates except basic items, the question became, what could fall hard enough to move across the floor? The lead officer stepped closer. Control, we need access to last night's camera feed. Time window, 1 to 3 o'clock. Cell 2 to 14. But before Control could answer, Mason quietly said something that froze the entire room. It happened after lights out, right after the noise. The officer turned sharply. What noise? Mason stared into the corner of his cell, the same corner with the scratch. The knocking sound, he whispered, from inside the wall. The officer stiffened. Inside the wall? Mason nodded slowly. I thought it was the pipes. But then, something shifted. A silence thicker than concrete filled the cell. Because knocking inside the wall of a high-security block? That's not normal. And whatever caused it was still unknown. The knocking inside the wall. The officers froze. Not because Mason was threatening them, but because what he said didn't make sense. Knocking inside the wall of a Category A cell? That wasn't routine noise. That wasn't plumbing. That wasn't ventilation. Something inside these walls is engineered to be so secure, so reinforced, so silent, that any unexpected sound means something is wrong. The lead officer stepped closer, his voice suddenly more serious. Mason, tell me exactly what you heard. Mason's eyes drifted toward the corner near the scratch. Cold, still, unmoving. It was late, Mason said quietly. Maybe after 1. The block was silent. Even the guards were doing quiet rounds. He paused. Then I heard it, 3 knocks. He tapped his finger on his knee. Slow. Even. Measured. The kind of rhythm that isn't an accident. At first, I thought it was the pipes, Mason continued, but then, something shifted in there. One of the officers leaned his ear toward the wall, not close enough to be unsafe, but close enough to hear if anything moved. Nothing. But the silence felt heavier now. Officers begin the wall inspection. Control, we need a structural check on cell 2 to 14. Possible internal disturbance, the sergeant said into his radio. Control answered immediately. Copy. Sending maintenance security and structural unit. For minutes. Maintenance security isn't about fixing pipes. They deal with tampering. Hidden spaces. Structural issues that could compromise a block. And the fact that they were being sent this fast meant Control was taking Mason's report seriously. The officer turned to Mason again. You said it happened after the noise. What shifted? Mason pointed at the bed. It felt like the frame moved. Just a little. like something pushed from underneath. The officers exchanged a look. Beds in this prison are bolted so deeply into the concrete floor that nothing underneath should be able to move them even 1 millimeter. Unless the noise wasn't from the bed, but from below the bed, from inside the floor cavity. And if that was true, then someone, or something, disturbed the structural layer of a Category A cell. That's one of the rarest and most serious warnings in a high-security prison. The maintenance team arrives. Heavy boots echoed down the corridor. 3 officers in dark overalls entered the cell with specialized scanners, thermal detectors, and long metal rods. They didn't talk much, didn't ask questions. They simply scanned the walls and floor with slow, practiced motions. First the left wall. Nothing. Then the right wall. Then the corner with the scratch. The thermal scanner flickered, blinked, and displayed a faint heat signature. Not hot, not warm, but warmer than the concrete around it. One of the maintenance officers frowned. "That's not normal," he said. Another tapped the wall lightly with the metal rod. 2 taps sounded solid. The third sounded hollow. The officer stopped, eyes narrowing. Behind him, the lead prison officer whispered, "Hollow?" On a Category A cell block. The maintenance officer nodded slowly. There shouldn't be any hollow points. The entire wall is solid reinforced concrete. No cavities. No spaces. Then came the words that changed the mood from tense to dangerous. "Something is behind this section." The block reacts instantly. Inmates along the corridor leaned forward, trying to hear. Officers spread out, creating a wider security line. Because if something, or someone, had created a hidden space inside a high-security block, it wasn't small. It wasn't harmless. It wasn't normal. And it wasn't recent. The lead officer turned to Mason one more time. "You didn't make that noise. And you didn't move this bed. So who did?" Mason swallowed hard. "I don't know," he whispered. But then he added something else, something quiet but chilling. "But I don't think it came from my cell." The officer's voice dropped. "Then where did it come from, Mason?" Mason looked at the floor, then at the wall, and finally at the officers. He pointed downward. "Under us." The block fell silent again. Because if the sound came from beneath the concrete floor of a Category A cell, then something far more serious was happening inside this prison. What lies beneath the block? The moment Mason pointed to the floor, every officer in the cell stiffened. Not because they believed him right away, but because if he was telling the truth, it meant something far more serious than a hidden object or a mistake. Movement under a Category A cell? That suggests a breach. A weakness. A space no one should ever have access to. And a breach, no matter how small, is the one thing every high-security prison fears. The lead officer tapped his radio. "Control, halt all movement on C block. We may have a structural irregularity beneath cell 2 to 14. Control responded instantly. "Acknowledged." All officers hold position. Containment protocol in effect. The prison tightened like a coiled spring. The maintenance team begins their deep scan. One of the maintenance specialists knelt on the floor. He placed a flat sensor, shaped like a small tablet, directly on the concrete. The device beeped softly as it scanned vibrations, density, and gaps beneath the floor. The officer stared at the screen. Static. Solid readings. Then a flicker. A tiny dip. Almost nothing. But enough for him to freeze. He adjusted the sensor. Scanned again. Another flicker. He called the others over. "Watch this, right here." He tapped the screen. A faint void signature appeared, small but clear. "Something's down there," he said quietly. "Something hollow." The lead officer stepped forward. "How big?" The specialist shook his head. "Too early to tell. Could be a pipe cavity, could be a drain channel, could be." But before he finished, Mason spoke up again. "It's not a pipe." The officer turned. "Mason, what makes you so sure?" Mason looked tired. "Not scared now, just weary. Because I've heard pipes my whole life in here. They hiss. They groan. They rattle." He pointed at the floor again. But what I heard last night wasn't a pipe. It was a knock. Someone knocking back. A cold quiet filled the room. Not fear. Not panic. Just the kind of silence people get when they hear something that simply shouldn't be possible. The officers asked the hard questions. The sergeant stepped closer. Mason, is there any chance someone passed you something from the floor cavity? A message? An object? Anything? Mason shook his head. No. I didn't get anything. Did you hear the knocking more than once? He hesitated. Yes, he said finally. 3 knocks, then silence, then a scrape. Like something shifting. The maintenance officer checked the floor again, running the scanner in slow circles. Another flicker. Then another. There's definitely a cavity, he said. But I can't tell how deep or how wide. He paused. Whatever caused that knock wasn't small. Control takes over. The radio cracked to life again. C-block officers stand by. We're sending structural forensics and the underground mapping unit. ETA, 6 minutes. All inmates remain secured. The underground mapping unit wasn't called unless something extremely serious was suspected. Their job wasn't maintenance. It was investigation. Hidden tunnels. Abandoned shafts. Structural tampering. Old architecture forgotten in blueprints. They checked the things nobody else thought to check. And now they were coming to C-block. Mason says something unexpected. As officers repositioned and inmates stayed locked inside their cells, Mason sat on his bed, staring at the floor. He looked calmer now, almost too calm. After a long moment, he said quietly, "This place is older than most of the officers here." He glanced at them. There are stories about these blocks. Stories about tunnels from before the renovations. Stories they never sealed properly. An officer frowned. Tunnels? That's rumor. There's nothing under this block except reinforced concrete. Mason shook his head slowly. That's what they told us. But I've heard things for months. Why didn't you say something? Mason's jaw tightened. Because no one believes inmates. And if someone really is down there, they wouldn't want me telling anyone. The officers exchanged a look. Someone down there? Impossible. Unthinkable. But the scratch on the floor wasn't imaginary. The hollow reading wasn't a glitch. And the knocking Mason described loosely matched a report filed months ago in a different block. A report everyone dismissed. The block holds its breath. Heavy boots approached from the corridor. The underground mapping unit had arrived. Carrying ground-penetrating scanners, acoustic detectors, and reinforced probes designed to detect voids deep within concrete structures. They entered the cell without hesitation. Everyone step back, the team leader said. We're running a deep scan. Mason sat still. Officers moved aside. The scanner hummed as the mapping officer swept it across the floor. Then the device stopped. Beeped. Beeped again. A yellow alert flashed on the screen. The officer stared, then slowly lifted his eyes. There's a space down there, he said. At least 2 feet deep. The lead sergeant stepped forward. What kind of space? The mapping officer exhaled. A man-made one. A chill spread through the cell. Not fear. Not chaos. But the realization that this wasn't an accident. Something was beneath the block. Something built deliberately. And whatever was down there may not be empty. The hidden space below. The moment the mapping unit confirmed the cavity, the entire cell seemed to shrink. Not physically, but emotionally. Everyone in the room felt the shift. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a mistake. This was real. A man-made space existed beneath one of the most secure cells in the entire block. And in a Category A prison, a hidden space is never an accident. The mapping unit team leader pressed deeper into the floor with the sensor. The screen flickered, then displayed a rough shape, a hollow section running horizontally for about 3 feet. That's a void, he said. Someone carved or left an empty chamber during an older build. It shouldn't be here. The lead prison sergeant asked the obvious question. Is it big enough for a person? The mapping officer hesitated. Then he nodded. Yes. That single word hit the room like a dropped weight. Mason breaks the silence. For the first time since the officers entered, Mason's voice had a different tone, steady, serious, almost resigned. "I told you, the noise didn't come from me." He pointed again at the floor. "It came from right under there." The sergeant stepped closer. "Mason, are you telling us someone is inside that void?" Mason didn't blink. "I don't know. But something is." The officers exchanged a look. Even the mapping unit paused. Because if there was someone beneath the floor, either 1. An old inmate passage that was never sealed. 2. Someone recently gained access to a forgotten structure. Either way, it meant danger. A deep acoustic scan begins. The mapping specialist placed a round acoustic disc on the floor, a device designed to amplify sound hidden inside concrete structures. He adjusted the dial slowly, turned up the sensitivity. At first, all he heard was static, then faint hums, then nothing. He leaned closer, tuned the frequency lower. The officers around him stayed completely still. Even Mason barely breathed. And then, a sound, so faint, almost impossible. But there, a scraping noise, slow, dragging. The specialist froze. "There's movement." The sergeant's voice stiffened. "Movement from what?" The specialist didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sound came again. A slow, deliberate shuffle. Not metal. Not pipes. Not rats. Something heavier. Something human. The specialist lifted his head. "There's definitely someone down there." The block reacts instantly. Officers stepped back into formation. Radios crackled. Control's voice exploded through the speakers. "All units, C block, prepare for containment. Unknown presence beneath structural level." Inmates throughout the block pressed against their cell doors, listening. Because the block understood one thing. A hidden person inside a high-security unit meant a breach. A breach meant danger. And danger meant the entire prison could shift into full lockdown at any moment. The sergeant, hands steady but voice lower, looked at the mapping unit. "How do we access the void?" The team leader swallowed. We don't. The only access point might be through maintenance shafts in the old sublevels beneath this wing." "Are those sealed?" The mapping officer exhaled through his teeth. "They were supposed to be." The room felt colder. If a forgotten sublevel still had an open path, someone might have been using it. For days, weeks, or longer. Mason adds one more detail. Just when the officers thought they had heard everything, Mason spoke again, quietly without looking up. "There's something else." Every officer looked at him. The knocking, it wasn't random. He tapped his knee again. 3 taps. 3 taps. Pause. The sergeant frowned. "Meaning?" Mason looked up slowly. "It's a signal." "A signal for what?" Mason swallowed. "For someone listening." A slow, creeping understanding settled across the officers. This wasn't just someone hiding. This wasn't someone trapped. This was communication. Someone down there was trying to send a message. And the worst part? It wasn't for Mason. He wasn't the intended recipient. He was just the one who heard it. The officers asked the final question. The sergeant took one step forward. "Mace, if that signal wasn't for you, who was it for?" Mason looked at the opposite wall, the wall that connected to the cell next door. A cell containing another high-risk inmate. He pointed. It was for him. The officers snapped their heads toward the adjoining cell. Because if the signal was meant for that inmate, and the void connected beneath both cells, then this wasn't one man hiding underground. This was 2 people communicating through a hidden passage no one knew existed. The mapping unit checked their scanner again. The void extended under both cells, meaning someone down there had access to more than one prisoner. And that changed everything. The inmate next door. The moment Mason pointed to the adjoining cell, every officer in the room turned sharply. Cell 2 to 15, the cell on the other side of the wall Mason had been staring at, belonged to an inmate named Dalton Reese. Dalton wasn't just any inmate. He was one of the block's most watched prisoners. Quiet, calculating, unpredictable, and known for forming alliances the way other inmates collect food, silently, carefully, and with purpose. He rarely spoke. rarely argued, rarely reacted. But he always listened. And that made him dangerous. The sergeant tapped his radio. "Control, we need eyes on cell 2 to 15 immediately." A voice crackled back. "Copy. Activating interior camera." Everyone waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Then a second voice, different, urgent. "Sergeant, you're going to want to see this." Inside cell 2 to 15. Officers moved to the small monitor mounted on the wall. The black and white camera feed flickered, then stabilized. Dalton Reese was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring directly at the camera. Not in surprise. Not in confusion. Almost like he was expecting this moment. His hands were folded. His posture steady. His face unreadable. But what made the officers tense was something else. Dalton wasn't looking at Mason's wall. He was looking at the floor. Right above where the hidden void was detected. The sergeant muttered. "He knows." He didn't mean knows about the scan. He meant Dalton knew about the space below. The signals. The knocking. And he wasn't worried. He was waiting. Officers moved to Dalton's cell. Within seconds, a tactical pair approached cell 2 to 15, shields up but protocol controlled. "Dalton Reese, step to the back wall and keep your hands visible." Dalton didn't move. Didn't blink. He just lifted his chin slightly, the smallest gesture, but one that made the officers tighten their grip. The sergeant repeated. "Dalton, step to the back wall." Nothing. One officer whispered. "He's not resisting. He's observing us." The sergeant lowered his voice. "Open the door." The cell door slid open with heavy steel friction. Officers stepped inside carefully. Dalton didn't flinch. Didn't rise. Didn't speak. Finally, the sergeant stepped in front of him. "Dalton, we need to ask you something. Did you hear anything last night? Any noises, any knocking?" Dalton slowly shifted his gaze from the floor to the sergeant's face. His expression was calm. Too calm. And then he said something that sent a chill through the entire block. "You heard it too." The officers freeze. Dalton had just confirmed it. He heard the knocking. He recognized it. And based on the tone of his voice, this wasn't new to him. The sergeant stepped closer. "What did you hear?" Dalton didn't look impressed or intimidated. He looked amused. "I heard someone trying to get our attention." "Whose attention?" Dalton smiled faintly. "You already know." The sergeant shook his head. "No, we don't." Dalton leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice into a calm whisper. "Then you should start by asking why the old tunnels were never filled properly." The officers stiffened. He continued. "And why the block architects made a mistake no one ever corrected." The pause. "And why someone down there learned how to move without being detected." The sergeant's voice sharpened. "Who is down there, Dalton?" Dalton's eyes drifted back to the floor. "That depends," he said quietly, "on how long you've been ignoring the signs." The mapping team interrupts. Just then, one of the mapping specialists rushed back from Mason's cell. "Sergeant, we've detected something new." The sergeant turned. "What now?" The specialist swallowed, pointing to his portable screen. "A second void." Silence. "A connected void." The sergeant stepped closer. "How large?" The specialist hesitated, then answered, "Large enough for someone to crawl through." The block seemed to stop breathing. Another void. Connected. Running beneath both cells. The sergeant turned back to Dalton. "Tell me who's down there." Dalton didn't blink. "Someone you forgot." The sergeant's jaw tightened. "Who?" Dalton looked up slowly, voice calm but chilling. "The person who never left." The officers exchanged confused looks. Dalton added one more sentence. "And they've been listening to us for months." The person who never left. Dalton's words hit the room like cold air rushing through an open door. The person who never left. Every officer froze. Even the mapping unit stopped moving. What did that mean? No inmate simply never leaves a Category A prison block without records, paperwork, or alarm. Everything is counted. Every movement noted. Every person accounted for. So Dalton's statement wasn't just strange, It was impossible. But impossible things don't leave scratch marks on concrete floors. Impossible things don't knock from inside sealed structures. Impossible things don't create hidden voids beneath cells. The sergeant stepped forward, voice steady but sharp. Dalton, explain what you mean. Dalton didn't move. Didn't blink. Didn't break eye contact. He simply lifted his hand and pointed. Not at the wall. Not at the floor. But at the corner of the cell where the older concrete met the newer reinforced layer. A seam so small most people wouldn't notice it. Dalton tapped the wall gently. Puh, puh, puh. The same rhythm Mason described. 3 taps. The pause. 3 taps. Then Dalton looked at the sergeant. You think every renovation was perfect? He asked calmly. You think every old structure was filled properly? You think every inmate transfer went exactly the way the paperwork said it did? The sergeant's jaw tightened. What are you saying, Dalton? Dalton leaned forward slightly. I'm saying someone they moved out of this block never made it out. Someone who disappeared before anyone knew. Someone who got stuck between the old walls and the new ones. Someone the system forgot. A chill spread through the cell. The sergeant's voice hardened. That's not possible. No inmate could survive inside a sealed space. Dalton shrugged. Maybe not for long. He nodded at the floor. But long enough to leave something behind. The mapping unit finds something new. Just then, the mapping specialist returned again, this time pale, gripping his scanner tightly. Sergeant, we found a metallic reading inside the second void. What kind of metallic reading? Flat. Rectangular. Thin. Not a tool. Not a pipe. Something placed deliberately. A device. The tech shook his head. No. It looks like paperwork. The block went silent. Paperwork? Inside a hidden cavity beneath 2 cells? Paperwork doesn't end up underground unless someone put it there, someone who didn't want it found. The sergeant responded quickly. Can you retrieve it? The specialist hesitated. It's wedged between layers. We might be able to extract it from the old maintenance access under the east corridor. The sergeant nodded. Do it. Now. 2 mapping techs rushed out. The remaining officers looked at Dalton again. Whose paperwork is under there? The sergeant demanded. Dalton didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at the floor, then back up. It belonged to the inmate they never transferred, he finally said. What inmate? Dalton's voice dropped to a near whisper, calm, quiet, unsettling. The one who was here before Mason. Mason reacts. In cell 2 to 14, Mason stood abruptly, the first sudden movement he'd made all day. I didn't replace anyone, Mason said from the other side of the wall, loud enough for everyone to hear. They assigned me this cell months after it was cleared. Dalton's reply was steady. That's what they told you. The sergeant turned sharply toward him. Dalton, stop speaking in riddles. Tell us who. But before he could finish, the radio crackled with an urgent voice from the mapping team. Sergeant, we've retrieved the object. It's an inmate file. The pause. And you're going to want to see the name on it. The sergeant responded. Bring it here. Moments later, 2 mapping officers returned carrying a dusty plastic folder, the kind used years ago before digital systems became standard. The outer label was faded, fresh, nearly unreadable, but not unreadable enough. The sergeant brushed away the dust. And the name appeared. Reynard Vale, inmate #A7412. Mason blinked. I've heard that name, he whispered. Dalton nodded. Everyone has, even if they don't realize it. The sergeant frowned. Vale? He was transferred years ago. Dalton stared at him. Was he? The sergeant opened the file. Inside were pages, old, damp, marked with time, showing dates, movements, disciplinary records. Then the final page. Transfer, approved. Destination, redacted. Date, blank, teenager, blank. Completely empty. Not processed. Not completed. Not signed. The transfer never happened. The sergeant's face hardened. Dalton, are you telling me Reynard Vale is? Dalton lifted a finger and pointed at the floor. Still here. The officers froze. Mason exhaled slowly, realizing the meaning. The knocking. The scratches. The void. Someone was down there. Someone who was never officially transferred. Someone the system forgot or hid. And if he survived in the tunnels for even a short time, he may have left more than paperwork behind. The prison that remembers. Inside Britain's toughest prisons, people imagine danger coming from loud voices, violent clashes, or bold escape attempts. But the truth is quieter. Hidden. Buried deep behind walls built long before most of the officers working inside them were even born. What happened inside C Block wasn't just a security scare. It wasn't just a misunderstood homemade picture frame. And it wasn't just a mysterious scratch on the floor. It was a reminder that these prisons hold more than inmates. They hold history, secrets, mistakes, stories the concrete never wanted to share. Mason was just one inmate trying to hold onto a fading photo of someone he loved, something fragile in a place where nothing is supposed to be fragile. Dalton was the inmate who watched more than he spoke, someone who noticed the things the system forgot to notice. And beneath their cells lay a hidden space the prison believed didn't exist anymore. A void, a forgotten pocket of the past, holding the file of a man who was supposed to be transferred, but never was. Reynard Vale. A name that had disappeared from paperwork. A man the system assumed had been moved. But the walls remembered him. Because prisons don't forget. They just stay silent. And sometimes, silence is louder than any alarm. The knocking under the floor? The scratch on the concrete? The flicker on the scanner? It wasn't random. It wasn't meaningless. It was the past trying to speak. Trying to say, something happened here. Something was left behind. Something was never finished. And now, the officers of C Block must confront a truth they never expected. This prison, Britain's most secure, still has shadows they haven't explored. Old tunnels no one sealed. Old secrets no one checked. Old stories no one told. Because the deeper you go inside these walls, the more you realize. It isn't just the inmates who are dangerous. Sometimes it's the prison itself. And as the alarms faded, as the cell doors closed, as the block returned to its harsh routine, one thing remained. A small scratch in the concrete. A forgotten file. A faint knocking only a few people could hear. Proof that inside Britain's toughest cell blocks, not every mystery stays buried. And not every inmate ever really leaves.